So Rachel went on to do this PhD from which she's talking today. However, I've missed out a lot of things in Rachel's career, particularly her museum experience. And Rachel's done a lot of different roles in research and other roles in the Pitt Rivers Museum, the British Museum, the Science Museum, and now the Scilly Museum, where she is collections manager and is developing the collection in the museum there. Also worked at Kew Gardens briefly on an internship. So a whole wide range of curatorial and other kinds of research experience, collections management experience in the museum sector. And I suppose that led to your interest, particularly in object collecting. So it's a great pleasure to introduce the seminar, as I have now done, and I'm hoping that the title is quite similar, as I can see on the screen, to the one we've advertised, maybe a slight difference, but Hunting the Whaler, Recovering the Collecting Practices of 18th and 19th Century Whalemen through Museum Collections and Archives. And just before I hand over to Rachel, just to say, Rachel will speak for about 40 minutes or 45 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. And if in the meantime you can turn your microphone off and turn your camera off, and then in discussion, if you want to, feel free to open your camera, and I'll explain how questions will work when we get there. So we're now going to, well, we're already sharing the screen, so we've got to hand over to Rachel, I think, at this point. And I'm minimizing that one. Is that right?
Yeah, they're good.
And
Need to admit some more.
okay, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. So thank you very much to the London Group of Historical Geographers and its conveners for letting me speak today. I really appreciate it. And also welcome to everybody joining us online. Can everybody hear me okay? Happy with this volume? Okay, great. Today's seminar will discuss the collecting practices of the whalemen of the British Southern Whale Fishery, highlighting their agency in the creation of new knowledge during the 18th and 19th centuries. Archives relating to British South Sea whaling are, as whaling historian A.E. Jones put it, often scrappy and scattered. However, as Tiffany Shellham asserts in her study of indigenous intermediaries within the archives of exploration, patience, searching and sifting, reading and reckoning with the archives can occasionally expose rich themes and stories. I've certainly found this to be true during my doctoral research into the topic of whaler collectors in archives and museums around Britain, Australia, New Zealand and America. The lifespan of the fishery from 1775 to 1860 coincides with an era of extensive activity in the collection and display of both natural and artificial collections in Britain. And yet scholars researching the history of collections have largely neglected South Sea whalers as a substantial collecting source. While a significant body of research has been devoted to collections made during major voyages of geographical exploration and territorial expansion, preeminently the voyages of Captain Cook, much less scholarly attention has been paid to other aspects of cultures of collecting in the Pacific, for example, amongst traders. This is due in part to the challenges of available source material in comparison with Royal Navy officers or missionaries, for example. The archives of trade are far more heterogeneous and less likely to be preserved. In most cases where trading ventures have left written sources, they are dispersed, hard to access and little known. The larger corporations, such as the East India Company and to a lesser extent the Hudson's Bay Company, stand as notable exceptions to this rule, having a bureaucracy and infrastructure to support collections in ways that mimic those of the Admiralty. Both thus maintain dedicated display spaces, the East India Company Museum and the Hudson's Bay Company Hall, and both produce prodigious amounts of records, enabling their scrutiny by future historians. Conversely, lacking a central repository for their collections, a role fulfilled by institutions such as Haslar Hospital Museum for the Royal Navy or the London Missionary Society Museum, founded for the display of material to reinforce the Christian message, collections made upon whaling voyages became distributed amongst disparate sources, including the commercial market, friends and family members, local societies and museums. Their links to the whaling trade were often poorly documented or not at all, and in many instances, provenance information failed to move with them as they migrated through these differing spheres. This can partially be deduced from the scale of collecting reported in archival sources compared with the small number of whaler collections within museums today. In an attempt to reveal the collecting practices of the historically under-researched group of men, I adopted a dual research methodology. This involves scrutinising both physical artefacts and specimens held in museums, which we refer to as whaler collections, and materials in libraries and archives, including both printed narratives and manuscript sources. This dual approach to objects and archives was born through conversations with museum colleagues, collection specialists and archivists, which highlighted the paucity of knowledge regarding collections with the South Sea whaling provenance within museums in Britain. Given the relative rarity of object collections identified as having a whaling provenance, it became important to consider a wider range of textual sources for collecting by whalers. Therefore, logbooks, journals, letters, probate records, customs bills of entries, and museum documentation were all consulted. In addition, published narratives, learned society archives, and newspaper archives were also utilised. These resources revealed moments of exchange and encounter, highlighting the global networks of exchange in which whalers were active, and allowed consideration of the specific forms and processes of whaler collecting, and how this shaped whalers' contributions to the creation and dissemination of new knowledge. Due to time constraints today, back going to move on. Sorry, technical issue.
Oh, that's me. Good.
Oh, great. Sorry, right, back in again. Due to time constraints today, I will touch upon collections found within museums which were prominently amassed by high status individuals, such as whale ship owners and captains. I will then move on to collecting evidence contained within journals and logbooks, with specific reference to whale ship surgeons, and two very unusual examples of journals authored by below-deck whalemen, in order to illustrate the different types of information contained within these sources. Firstly, I will take a moment to explain who the British Southern Whale Fishery were, why they came into being, and why they were so perfectly placed to collect and distribute new knowledge in multiple forms. Prior to the outbreak of the American War of Independence in 1775, the American whaling fleet, sailing out of the east coast ports of Nantucket, New Bedford, and smaller neighbouring harbours, monopolised the sperm whale oil market into Britain. The valuable oil and spermaceti produced in the head cavity of the sperm whale was increasingly being used for the lubrication of fine machinery, such as watches and clocks, and in the making of candles to light the homes and cities of Britain. It had the benefit of being cheaper than beeswax, burning brighter than traditional tallow candles, and smelling much less repugnant. In an attempt to control the political and social unrest in the American colonies of Massachusetts and New England, where the American fleet was based, the British government introduced the Restraining Acts of 1775. These prohibited the New England colonies from fishing in the waters off Newfoundland and the American Atlantic coast, limited the export and import of any goods with Great Britain, and prohibited trade with other colonies. These embargoes on American produce created a shortage of sperm whale oil and associated products in Britain. To alleviate this, Parliament introduced a complex system of bounties, premiums, and acts to support the British whaling industry. They offered incentives to British-built vessels, which returned from the South Seas, defined as anywhere south of the equator, with the largest cargoes of oil. In addition, they offered financial inducements for experienced American whalemen to relocate to London, where they could become masters of British whaling vessels. As these individuals were highly regarded within the trade, Prime Minister Pitt, wishing to take advantage of their expertise, recommended paying relocation costs for them and their families, and allowing owners to re-register their ships as British vessels, and therefore benefit from the same bounties paid to British merchants. For the Americans, the economic crisis caused by trade restrictions made this an attractive proposal. Thus, the BSWF facilitated the migration of American whalemen, mostly Quakers from the East Coast, into Britain. These individuals were already embedded in the global networks of trade associated with the production and distribution of whale oil, and although British-based, archival evidence relating to the BSWF made its way into overseas collections, particularly in America, Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, and Hawaii, and collected artifacts were also distributed worldwide. Whale ships either took the west route around Cape Horn, favoured from about 1790 to 1820. Are you playing with my...
Sorry, Rachel, I tried to get rid of this.
you not?
Yeah, okay.
I should start again. Whale ships either took the west route around Cape Horn, favoured from 1790 to 1820, or the east route via the Cape of Good Hope. From there, they would voyage to South Australia via the whaling grounds of the Indian Ocean, or they entered the Pacific whaling grounds to the east of New Guinea, around New Britain, New Ireland, Buka, and the Northern Solomons, before sailing north towards the Japan grounds, often doubling back and revisiting favoured whaling grounds more than once during a voyage. Once the holds were full, the whaling vessel could either retrace her track or carry on and do a circumnavigation of the world. Although a quick, successful voyage meant that the owners would recoup their investments sooner, unlike merchant vessels, whalers often took a circuitous route following their prey. In the early 1840s, Surgeon John Wilson stopped counting the number of times he crossed the equator on the 8th occasion. The global scope of these operations meant that whalemen and the BSWF were perfectly placed to act as agents of territorial expansion, naming and claiming for the British government. Indeed, whalemen's journals are littered with charts of bays and coastlines, illustrating the potential use of whale ships as proxy survey vessels. Furthermore, whale ships were ideally suited to the transportation of human cargo, as they left port empty of goods. The War of Independence meant the loss of the American penal colonies favoured by the British government, which found its jail system under increasing strain. As of 1778, whale ship owners increased their profits by hiring their vessels to the British government as convict transport ships to Port Jackson, then returning with cargoes of oil gathered around Australia and New Zealand, but also with new knowledge regarding the furthest reaches of the known world. Artefacts, geographical discoveries, and in several instances, indigenous people were all transported to Britain on returning whale ships from the 1790s onwards. These included 2 Aboriginal men who travelled to Britain, along with a collection of natural history specimens, which included 4 live kangaroos, in 1792, the first recorded Maori to visit England in 1806 on the whaler Ferret, and in 1824, the King and Queen of Hawaii, King Kamehameha II and his wife Kama'amalu, travelled to Britain on the whale ship Laig, intending to meet King George. They travelled with a significant amount of Hawaiian material culture. While the artefacts brought by Kamehameha and his wider retinue were not collected by whalemen directly, their transport on the Laig illustrates the role of whale ships as conduits for the transportation of artefacts that subsequently ended up in collections within Britain in the British Museum, the National Museum of Scotland, and the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and also further afield in Germany, Brazil, and Hawaii. In short, the British Southern Whale Fishery was an internationally operated, multifaceted organisation that, in addition to whaling, was involved in geographical discovery, surveying, convict transportation, trading, and the couriering of people and goods. With regard to viewing collections as evidence, I aim to cast as wide a net as practically possible over museum collections in Britain to search for whaler collections, not in order to produce an exhaustive inventory, but to identify specific case studies that illuminated the collecting practices of whalers, as the likelihood of matching up the provenance information found within archival sources with physical collections was incredibly unlikely. And this is something that Felix and I discussed at length. I had originally intended to create a sort of inventory of everything collected on these whale ships and where they went and where they were deposited and all sorts of other grand ideas. But we came to the conclusion that who does this actually benefit? You end up with massive lists of artifacts, mostly drawn from archival sources, but it doesn't really tell you anything. It's the patterns within the list that are important. Whose collections are these? What was their status on board? Were there certain locales favoured for certain the collection of certain artifacts? Were they collecting on demand? What things curtailed or aided the collecting of artifacts and specimens on board whale ships? These questions were far more interesting than an exhaustive inventory. I targeted museums using a systematic approach, namely email, social media, and collections database searches. Email requests for information on whalers and their collecting activities were also sent to specialist groups, such as those associated with the British Southern Whale Fishery website, the Museum Ethnographers Group, Pacific Studies Organisation. Alongside formal inquiries to museums, social media was also utilised, which provided many potential leads for collections. And actually, if you're ever doing a collections review, social media is a lot quicker for getting a response than emailing. People are just too busy to respond to emails. Just a tip there. Maritime museums and museums in coastal locations were considered to be an obvious place to look for further evidence, as it was hoped that thematic displays referencing whalings in the South Seas might also touch upon the subject of ethnographic and natural history collecting amongst whalemen. However, results showed that the British Southern Whale Fishery was largely missing from the national narrative of maritime history presented within maritime and coastal museums. Discussions with museums professionals revealed that many of them knew nothing of the BSWF, their knowledge being confined to the northern whale fisheries active in the Arctic. As expected, many Scottish museums were found to have displays upon Arctic whaling and hold artefacts collected by whalemen on vessels belonging to the northern whale fisheries, showing that there was indeed a strong precedence for collecting amongst whalemen. However, these collections were discounted due to their Arctic links. However, patient database trawling did elicit positive response from other institutions, although it must be noted that collections databases are by no means equal, and the results predominantly favoured larger, better funded museums. This approach was aided by researching other successful collections review projects, such as Collections Review held at Bristol Museum in 2008, a review of Kiribati armour held in museum collections across Britain, and a review of Pacific material held in Scottish museums undertaken by the National Museums of Scotland in 2013 to 14. Small collections compiled by BSWF whalemen were found in Bristol Museum and Art Gallery, the British Museum, the Pitt Rivers Museum, Oxford, National Museums of Scotland, Museums of Liverpool, the Great North Museum, and the Bishop Museum, Hawaii. Several of these are linked collections, sharing an original collector, but having been dispersed over time to separate institutions. Not altogether unsurprisingly, extant collections predominantly favour higher ranking members of the whaling fraternity, such as captains, surgeons, or whale ship owners. The ethnographic and natural history collections of whale ship owners became a fruitful vein of research, as it was found that their whaling captains were collecting for them, illustrating the potential for whalemen to act as field workers. There is evidence for this practice from the very beginning of the fishery's life. In 1791, the captain of the Britannia, which was both a convict transporter and a whale ship, wrote from Port Jackson to his employer, Samuel Enderby. At the end of his letter, he wrote, "I'm collecting some beautiful birds and land animals and other curiosities for you." This as yet unlocated collection would be one of the earliest artefact shipments out of Australia post Captain Cook. Collections originating from whale ship owners included the Bennett collection at the Pitt Rivers and the Roch collection at Bristol Museum and Art Gallery. William Bennett was a prominent whale ship owner based in Farringdon, whose whaling captains collected for him. Prior to 1827, he donated several artefacts to the Ashmolean, which in turn were transferred to the Pitt Rivers in 1886. These included a 17-foot Maori war canoe, seen here on the left, a carved wooden canoe stretcher, shells, a model of an Indonesian canoe, and a large example of a swordfish, which is now unlocated. Artifacts from the Bennett collection were also found in the British Museum, the Docklands Museum, and the Field Museum in Chicago, with associated labels stating certain artifacts were collected for Bennett by his captains. Between 1824 and 1831, whale ship owner Benjamin Roch donated a wide range of objects to the newly formed Bristol Institution for the Advancement of Science and Art, henceforth the Bristol Institution. The surviving Roch collection includes weaponry, paddles, clothing, headrests, adzes, an outrigger canoe with sail, basketry, tappercloth, and items of ornamentation. Roch himself never travelled to the Pacific. The collection is significant for several reasons. As part of the founding collection of the Museum of the Bristol Institution, precursor to the Bristol Museum and Art Gallery, It was one of the earliest collections of Pacific ethnography to be presented within the formal setting of a learned society in the Southwest. It includes artifacts of considerable historical interest, including an Aleutian seal gut parka and a pair of Marquesan earplugs made of elephant ivory rather than the traditionally used material of sperm whale ivory. As an American whale ship owner living in Britain, Rachael's collection presents the opportunity to consider the international procurement networks that he had available to him and how his familial associations within the whaling trade informed these collecting practices. Indeed, the overwhelming Pacific focus of this collection, encompassing artifacts from both North and South, and its palpable links to whaling with the inclusion of such artifacts as the head of a harpoon taken out of a whale captured in the Pacific, quote, and whale's teeth and items made from whalebone, would suggest he drew heavily upon his whaling employees in order to compile his collection. Furthermore, the inclusion of the Aleutian material culture and an Indian canoe, which through research was found to be an American Indian canoe, not rather than a generic use of the term Indian, suggest a wider network of contacts than his own South Sea whale ships. Collections accrued by captains accounted for the Lawson collection at the Pitt Rivers, Starbuck collection at the British Museum, and single donation collections, including this enormous sperm whale jawbone at the National Museums of Scotland. There's also a smaller one in Newcastle. The woodlark jaw in Scotland is on display in the main hall and advertised as the largest piece of scrimshaw in the world. So I was slightly surprised when I got in touch with them and said, do you have anything that relates to whaling? And they went, no, we haven't got anything that relates to whaling. And I went and visited them and I was like, it's massive. To be fair, they said, oh, that's a zoological specimen. Look at the accession number. It's got a Z before it. So they had obviously searched their ethnographic database and not come up with this absolutely enormous specimen. But that just shows that how these artifacts can move between different definitions. It came in as a zoological specimen. It's now an ethnographic specimen, an example of sailor's art. This lower jaw, complete with its full complement of teeth, is engraved on both pan bones, the large flat section at the back of a whale's jaw. That would correspond to sort of here on us, this flat bit here. On one side with an image of the sperm whale, and on the other side with a view of the British Southern Whale Fishery woodlark during a sperm whale hunt in the Banda Sea of Indonesia. To be fair to the museum, unless you knew of the woodlark's association with the BSWF, or that any British ships whaling in Indonesian waters during the 1800s will be part of this fishery, they can be forgiven for not making a definitive link between South Seas whaling and this artefact. But this is indicative of how little known South Seas whaling fleet is within the British maritime consciousness. One of the interesting things about this artefact is that the Associated Interpretation Panel states that the jaw was commissioned by Edinburgh University in 1842. During this point in time, the university had an active collections policy spearheaded by Professor of Natural History Robert Jameson. And it's quite possible that he would want an impressive sperm whale bone such as this for his collection and arrange for it to be collected by fellow Scot Captain William Hardy. If the collection of the jawbone was indeed commissioned by the university, it hints at the role played by learned societies and educational institutions in directly guiding whaler collecting. However, I can find no further information regarding this as a commission. Fewer examples of extant collections were found relating to subaltern whalemen within museums. Therefore, it's possible that social class was a factor in the recording of information. Therefore, any provenance information supplied by lower-ranking whalemen, as with other maritime actors of similar social standing in the Navy, went largely unrecorded, leading to the common assumption that whalemen were not collecting, selling, or donating. However, based on the evidence found within archival sources, I argue that such whalemen were fully engaged in practices of artifact collection and knowledge generation, not just for themselves, but also in supporting roles such as collecting for others. The principal archival evidence for collecting on board whale ships lies within the journals and logbooks of whalers, with different types of knowledge synthesised within them. A journal is usually thought of as a personal diary written in the first person and often narrated in a casual style directed to a loved one or friend for their amusement. As such, it is typically authored by one individual who is often, though not always, prominently identified. In the case of the BSWF, these journals predominantly belonged to whaling surgeons. Such surgeons were a legal requirement on South Seas whaling vessels and authored incredibly detailed, beautifully illustrated journals, the overwhelming majority of which have never been published and today sit largely unread in archives. However, two notable published examples include those of Thomas Beale, A Few Observations of the Natural History of the Sperm Whale, and Frederick Devil Bennett's narrative of a whaling voyage around the world, published in 1839 and 1840 respectively. Thomas Beale collected such a substantial haul of objects that on transferring to the whale ships Sarah and Elizabeth, the whaleboat, quote, the whaleboat that I was in, so completely filled with curiosities and shells that the oars could not be used, so that the men were obliged to make use of paddles instead. By Beale's own admission, each whaleboat was 27 feet long and 4 feet in breadth. Even if we make allowances for the whaling gear stowed inside, Beale appears to have collected an enormous amount of artefacts. Whereas Surgeon Bennett collected a total of 743 dried specimens of plants, 233 preparations of animals, most of which being rare or unique. The majority of the botanical specimens were deposited with the eminent botanist A.B. Lambert, Vice President of the Linnaean Society, and to Professor Donne, who presumably was David Donne, Professor of Botany at King's College London and librarian to the Linnaean Society. His zoological specimens were deposited in the Hunterian Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons. The only artefacts of material culture which Bennett appears to have collected during the whole voyage were 2 adzes from Pitcairn Island given to him by a descendant of a bounty mutineer. He makes no mention of these objects or where they were deposited. These images are from the journals of Surgeon John Lyell, now in Perth Museum and Art Gallery in Scotland. Lyell was a whaling surgeon on the Ranger between 1829 and 1832. His beautifully illustrated journals were donated by a family descendant in the 1840s and proved to be a rich source of information with regard to whaler collecting. Lyell collected extensively. The small drawing of an axe-like implement on the right-hand side image is the only image of material culture to be found in his richly illustrated journals. He focused on depicting natural history specimens rather than artifacts, and the images are very much presented in a way that mimics publication or possibly aspires to it. The environmental challenges of storage aboard a whaling vessel explain why natural history specimens, such as bird skins and botanical specimens, were so much at risk, whereas more robust items, including those made of materials such as bone, shell, or wood, would stand a stronger chance of surviving the voyage. Perhaps offering an explanation as to why illustrations found within journals such as Lyell's are predominantly of natural history specimens rather than material culture. The overwhelming difficulties in transporting such specimens home necessitated their accurate description and/or illustration, standing proxy for the real thing. Indeed, in 2013, a researcher analysing Lyell's journal as part of a review of Pacific collections in Scottish museums found he had described a type of flying squid not officially recorded as a species until the 1880s. It was not until 2011 that scientists were able to show this squid really does propel itself through the air, just as Lyell had described in his journal in great detail, leading researchers to question if Lyell's description and illustration provided one of the earliest written language accounts of this particular cephalopod. And the squid is in the top left of that image. The journals of whaling surgeons tell us not just about their own collecting activities, but those of the wider crew, making them an indispensable resource for the study of whalers as collectors. These sources suggest that interactions with indigenous populations occurred virtually everywhere that whale ships went, offering whalemen unparalleled opportunities to collect for personal interest, exchange or sale as curiosities back home. Whether they landed or not, significant amounts of trade took place between whale ships and indigenous communities via the canoes which paddled offshore to greet the ship, as can be seen here in the illustration by whale ship surgeon John Wilson of canoes approaching the whale ship Tipsy off Buka of Papua New Guinea. According to Wilson, the customary articles for barter at this locale included bows and arrows and clubs and spears, quote, all extremely well made, neatly and ingeniously formed. These they freely disposed of to ships for iron hoop or clasp knives. Although these material exchanges were for predominantly small portable objects and foodstuffs, this was not always the case, and Wilson described at some length examples of indigenous craft that were available for sale. Wilson further described the captain of the Gypsy, Captain Gibson, taking the opportunity to purchase a 12-man canoe during such a vessel-to-vessel trade scenario. It seems unlikely that the collection of this substantial canoe was the captain's first and only foray into collecting. Indeed, later in the voyage, Wilson tells us he was gifted a young alligator about 4 or 5 feet long by a local monarch in Timor. Unfortunately, the surgeon makes no mention of where these items were stored within the vessel, though he did note that the surgeon of the whale ship Diana had been killed by an alligator, albeit on shore, and one suspects that the captain surreptitiously disposed of the animal. Of the canoe, there is no further trace, either in the journal or on its arrival in Britain, highlighting the void between archival evidence and the physical object. Despite the fact that surgeons were a legal requirement on the 2,500 voyages made by the British Southern Whale Fishery, we know the names of less than 200 of them. Of these 200, the total number of journals authored was 13. A social media call out revealed the location of one more, a lost South Sea Whaling Surgeons Journal. This journal was kept by Edward Harris of the George Home in 1832 to 1835, and it was thought to be in private hands, but is actually in Littlehampton Museum in Sussex. This brought the total to 14. 5 are published, 9 are unpublished, and only 3 of which are available to view in Britain. These were slim pickings indeed. However, surgeons are not the only authoritative sources. There are further 5 journals written by whalemen of various ranks, including 2 written by foremost hands, 1 written by a captain's wife, and a handful written by captains themselves. Primary source material written by below-deck whalemen on BSWF vessels is extremely rare. Research for this thesis revealed only 2 unpublished accounts. These sources offer insights into the damp and cramped conditions of the forecastle. They outline the geography of the whaling vessel, the international makeup of the crew, and attitudes towards authority and aspects of health from a unique perspective. Henry Ransom was a 21-year-old East Anglian man who signed on as an ordinary seaman in 1831 on the whaling ship Elizabeth. Henry Foster was a 14-year-old from Deal in Kent who was an apprentice aboard the Sussex in 1840. Both were first-time sailors who went to sea with their family's blessing. Ransom's journal is in the State Library of New South Wales, and Foster's journal, written in the 1860s, but recounting his time aboard the Sussex 20 years before, is held in the Rayner Special Collections Library in Dartmouth, USA. Genealogical research, corroborated by evidence within his journal, strongly suggests that Henry Ransom was the son of a successful industrialist from Ipswich. The Ransom family are still widely known within East Anglia due to their success in designing and patenting agricultural implements during the late 18th century. By the mid-1800s, Ransom and Sons employed over 1,500 men, and it would seem that Henry was relatively well educated. Forster went to sea following the steps of his older brother, and like Ransom, he was also well educated. He attended a nautical school established in Deal by gentlemen, principally captains in the Royal Navy, under the patronage of the local parish clergyman. Here he excelled in mathematics and navigation. Therefore, both young men had an education that was above and beyond that of basic literacy and numeracy. Indeed, Forster worked out the observations for Captain Hammer, and Ransom took to teaching an islander to read and write in Tonga. Information extracted from their journals show that both these whalemen collected material culture and natural history specimens, although Ransom's collection ranged far more widely than Foster's. However, there is no trace of their collections today other than within their journals. Between them, they collected shells, corals, fishhooks, and in case of Ransom, items of weaponry, mats, and spears. In addition, Ransom attempted to procure a tiki at the Bay of Islands in 1831, noting that they set great value on them and are very unwilling to part with them. Despite his best efforts, he failed. Both individuals collected natural history specimens, specifically corals and shells, and Ransom in particular expressed a great interest in the wildlife he saw. Meanwhile, Forster narrated a singular event after a typhoon off the coast of Japan. The crew caught and hauled on board a trunk, which is a leatherback turtle, which he described as being over 17 feet long. Quote, "We lowered and harpooned him and hoisted him on board. He weighed nearly 2 tons. What appeared to be the shell of the animal was nothing but a thick, horny blubber and produced more than a barrel of oil. He measured over 17 feet from nose to tail. The flesh was scarcely edible." If one considers that the largest leatherback ever recorded was only 9 feet long, then this would indeed have been a truly remarkable occurrence. Forster himself states in his journal that he had never seen one bigger than 3 foot, and that was in the British Museum. The dimensions of this catch, as described by Forster, clearly raised doubts about his credibility as an accurate observer and reporter of natural knowledge. However, he went to great pains to stress his Christian convictions throughout his journal, and one senses that exaggeration was not in his nature. Furthermore, over 30 years later, Forster was still repeating his story. He was the author of an article entitled "Turtle of Gigantic Size," which was published in The Leisure Hour, a popular magazine published by the Religious Tract Society in March 1876. While there was a surgeon aboard the Sussex, Forster makes no mention of any attempt to dissect or preserve the specimen. Even if the crew of the Sussex had wanted to do so, one suspects the logistics of storing a 2-ton turtle, alive or dead, would have been insurmountable. Furthermore, announcement of the discovery would likely have been deferred to either the surgeon or the captain as the preeminent men aboard the vessel, just as it did in the examples of the whalebone jaw mentioned earlier in Scotland. Artifacts such as these were hunted, caught, brought on board and processed by the crew, not by the men who ultimately donated them. Thus, the role played by the crews of whale ships in the collection of oversized natural history specimens is largely erased from the provenance of such objects. If journals tell us of the personal experiences of the author, in contrast, a logbook is an authorized record of observed events from the start to the end of a voyage. As such, it offers different types of collecting information from that of a journal, rarely referencing the act of collection itself, rather focusing on the harvesting of observational data. Observation of location, weather, sea condition, catches, and orders given were logged daily. In addition, logbooks recorded the location of fruitful whaling grounds for the vessel's owners, whilst for the captain they acted as a form of evidence in the event of accusations of misconduct or mismanagement of the vessel. Such sources are largely devoid of superfluous description. Thus, the phrase "men employed variously" was written regularly within whaling logs in place of any detailed explanation. Therefore, they often make somewhat dry reading. One might assume on that basis that logbooks would be of limited use for assessing the collecting practices of whalemen. However, logbook evidence reveals the whale ship to be a active site of knowledge production, and as such can be a useful resource for historians and researchers. The increasingly standardized format used within logbooks for reporting such things as meteorological data, ocean conditions, whale hunting grounds have proved useful for scientists wishing to collate such data. Indeed, the use of whaling logbooks as a reliable source material was pioneered by American hydrographer and head of the US Navy's Depot of Charts and Instruments during the 1840s and 50s, Lieutenant M.F. Murray. Murray produced over 70 sea charts drawn from evidence found within American merchant, naval and whaling voyages. These include track charts, trade wind charts, pilot charts, thermal charts, storm and rain charts, and whale distribution charts. Furthermore, such is the logbook's unimpeachable reputation for truth-telling, the American government set to scouring whaling logs in the late 1930s in an attempt to prove American sovereignty over specific islands in the South Pacific. These islands were to become of significant strategic importance during the Second World War, and as such are indicative of the political value held within these sources. Thus, multiple examples of mapping and surveying found within the pages of whalemen's logs remained largely undiscovered until they became of strategic importance in the 20th century. As historian H.E. Maud pointed out with regard to the Central Pacific, an area he stated it was largely ignored by the main voyages of discovery, the names which appear on the regional roll of discoverers can seldom be found in the published editions of voyages. In all but a handful of instances, they are the captains of merchants or whaling vessels who would be startled indeed to find themselves the objects of historical research. Furthermore, species-specific information, such as whale kills, in addition to sightings and losses, were also noted in logbook with a stamp or a drawing, with different tail shapes denoting different species of cetacean. Whales were often denoted in logs by the quantity of barrels of oil that they yielded. They were also verbally referred to as such, for example, as a 60-barreler, or a large bull whale might be a 90-barreler, thus confusing the boundary between animal and commodity. 19th century logbooks therefore continue to be of use to marine biologists harvesting data regarding historical distribution of specific whale species, their oil yields and migratory patterns. Historian Graham Burnett suggests that the close observation of species and environment as expressed within logbooks reflect the whalemen's engagement with the natural world to be above and beyond that of a purely mercantile preoccupation. Indeed, during my research, I found illustrations of deformed whales in several whaling logs, the author noting that such whales tended to have thicker skin, yield less oil, and be markedly more aggressive than other examples of their species. This is the kind of comparative knowledge that only comes with the intimate observation of a species, their anatomy and habits, thus making the zoological observations of whalemen evidence for the creation of natural knowledge aboard whale ships, even if they didn't know it at the time. And one such twisted jaw was on display at the Natural History Museum's Beneath the Surface exhibition in 2017. Just to look at the stamp in the whaling log on the left-hand side, you can see it has 12 written above it. That relates to 12 barrels of oil, which is a paltry amount of oil to extract from a whale. They wouldn't normally lower a boat for a whale that was going to give you that kind of, it wasn't worth the risk. So it, yeah, that's what that twisted jawbone whale gave. To conclude, there are logs and journals in existence for about 4,000 voyages made by American whale ships. In contrast, there has been comparatively little interest in retaining or collecting documents relating to South Seas whaling in Britain. For most of its history, the British industry never seriously rivaled American whaling, either in scale or economic importance, despite for a short period of time being the largest fleet in the world. Indeed, writing in the inaugural volume of the Journal of Pacific History in 1966, historian H.E. Maud identified only 5 known logbooks from British South Seas whale ships. Today, the total sits at 33 worldwide. Added to the known number of journals, this brings the total number of logs and journals to about 55, in addition to the other archival sources listed at the beginning of this talk, which we have not had time to mention here. Fortunately for me, the majority of are available to view on microfilm in institutions around Britain, and I have been able to systematically review all of them, with the exception of the one that turned up in Littlehampton Museum, which I couldn't go and see because of COVID. And I plan on going to see that soon. I just never got there. There will be more out there Occasionally, whaling logs come to light in auction catalogues, such as that of the whale ship Mary, which was subsequently bought by the Museum of London Docklands in 1982, now on display in London and the Whaling Trade, a small exhibition dedicated to the British Southern Whale Fishery. The fishery's close relationship with London as a predominant port of departure and return makes the Museum of London Docklands a particularly appropriate location to house this display. However, it turned out to be the only such display focusing solely on South Seas whaling in the UK. My survey of Pacific artefacts in UK museums with a whaler provenance identified a total of 120 objects with links to the British Southern Whale Fishery, including a significant quantity of scrimshaw as well as indigenous artefacts. These results, while sobering, certainly underestimate the actual number of artefacts associated in some way with the British Southern Whale Fishery, either having been collected by whalers or transported on whale ships. Far more collecting was identified via archival sources and by using a dual methodology in researching the BSWF, giving equal weight to evidence in archival documentation and artifactual collections. I've been able to highlight the different types of collecting information available within such sources and how these can speak to each other in ways that would not have been possible through an investigation limited into physical collections alone. Thus, the collecting activities of captains are revealed within surgeons' journals. The scale of trading undertaken by below-deck sailors revealed in the case of Forster and Ransom. The role of painted illustrations to act as proxy specimens in situations where specimens stood little chance of survival. I've highlighted other aspects of the history of whaler collecting above and beyond that of the accumulation of physical specimens by drawing out elements of knowledge generation linked to the gathering of information by whalers, including oceanographic, geographical, and species knowledge. It is hoped that in time, the multiplicity of roles played by whalers in the creation of new knowledge will receive wider recognition within the history of collecting. That is exactly 45 minutes.
Thank you very much.